Morning, everyone. Just a quick check. Can you guys hear me? Maybe say yay in the chat. Um, we'll give it a minute, maybe more, since I see more people joining. So we'll start in about a minute. Aaron, I'm going to ask you here, do I need to pull anyone else on the stage? Let me start sharing my screen. Okay, so let me share my screen now. And hopefully everyone can see this. Okay, quick check. Screen sharing okay with everyone? It's weird for me that it's just one directional, so I can't hear you guys. You can just hear me. As soon as I get okay, I'll get started here. Perfect. Let's roll. All right. Welcome to day 7, everyone. Congratulations on making so far. Today we'll be focused on digital health population-based data resources. It's a mouthful. We'll be going through a lot of material that I'll cover shortly in the agenda. But let's start where we all, I guess, started, right? It's important to acknowledge, and especially important for me being new to CAMH, that CAMH has been situated on lands that have been occupied by First Nations. CAMH is committed to reconciliation, and we will honor the land through programs and places that reflect and respects its heritage. We will embrace the healing traditions of ancestors and weave them into our caring practices. We will create new relationships and partnerships with First Nations, Inuit, Métis, and share the land and protect it for future generations. And in fact, the last bit of this will become hopefully somewhat clear in some of the research that I'm going to talk about today in terms of how digital needs to bridge the divide between and not create more divide. And so we'll talk about that more. With that, that's where we are today. So it's been a long journey for most of you. Thank you for sticking on with us. As I said, today we'll be talking about digital health and population-based data resources, and it basically sort of connects the micro level domain-focused stuff that you guys have listened from Srijoy, Danielle, about genetics and transcriptomics. How do you link that to specific brain circuitry? Then join those microcircuits into whole brain modeling, look at cognitive aspects of it, and then how do you take this in-lab, in-clinic constructs, most of the time, to the real-world lived experience of people's in-case mental health. So that's going to be the focus for the first half. I also want to remind, just as housekeeping, there are multiple ways to connect. It's a little new for me that I'm using this interface for the first time, and when I'm doing screen sharing, I don't see any chat window on my side. So I'll probably look in the chat in every few minutes or so, but not all constantly. So instructors for today, we have two of my amazing colleagues along with me. So Joanna, you will be talking about the Brain Health Data Bank and how it sort of brings together many concepts from clinical care and research in terms of data integration. Dan will be talking about various data resources. And then I'm going to kick off today with basically a high-level 101 on what exactly is digital health for mental health. So there's a lot going on in this field. It's a very nascent and new field and growing field. And I'm going to, hopefully my goal is to give you a high-level sort of teaser on what it actually means for understanding someone's lived experience. So that's going to be our hourly sort of agenda. I'm going to kickstart it now. And essentially, this is what I plan to cover. How does technology sort of bring together and into a cohesive way that can impact and transform mental health? And it's not about replacement. The goal is not technology will come and will replace the way care is imparted. It's definitely not that. And if you're wondering what am I doing, I'm trying to switch on my fan because it's getting hot in here. Okay. So there are three things, right? So I'll go through a 101 on digital health for mental health. That's the why. I'll talk about the how. So these are a few examples, and I'll literally walk you through how will you design a study, and then the when. So when should you use these? It's not if you have the tools, you need to deploy them all the time. There has to be a right space and fit for it, and we'll talk about potential challenges in the field and how one could address it. The best thing you all can do is stop me and ask questions. And as I say that, I'm also thinking, how will I notice those? So I'm going to start looking at screen as much as I can. The challenge on my side is when I go live with my full screen, I don't see a question. So hopefully my colleagues can either Slack me or we'll do a question check every 20, 30 minutes or so. All right. So let's get started with the why. And it will require me to do some level setting. So some of you might be aware of some of the concepts that I'm going to talk about. Others, it might be new or a refresher. But my goal is to bring everyone on the same table so they can see the same plate from the same view. And so bear with me as I sort of go through the basics of it. And I want to start with something that motivates me, and you will find in most of the slides and presentations I give about digital mental health. And I came across this 5 to 7 years ago, and I have stuck with it. This is an excerpt from a book written by Emil Krembil, a famous German psychiatrist. And if you have not seen or read this book, I would highly recommend it. But the point is, it's almost 100 years, and the fact is still true. We don't have an objective yardstick to assess someone's emotional well-being. And that's an abstract, right? Emotion could mean many different things, but that's the point here, right? There are so many things that could be subjectively assessed and fraught with our own biases. And that's the whole sort of premise in a sense of where and how can we gather this experience in a more quote-unquote objective manner. And there is a whole debate on what's objective and what's subjective. We'll get into that. Let me also do a very high-level retro on this. I know you guys have probably the right background in terms of what is mental health, but I want to make sure it becomes very clear. This conversation is mental health. It's not about going to a clinic and getting assessment or getting a neuroimaging done and etc. Everyday conversations about how are you, I'm feeling not okay, or everything I do doesn't fit well. It's a conversation about mental health. And the point I'm trying to make here is it is all around us. It doesn't have to start in the clinic. The way we interact our quality of life, our experiences around us, with us, all impact and spew signals about our mental health. And so hopefully this theme will show up in various different ways in how we can tease apart different kinds of signals in social media data or in your smartphone usage data. And it's not about being 100% precise that, oh, you have a serious mental illness. It's more about the triaging aspect of it and to somewhat quantify it, right? It's not about being 100% precise. This hopefully is very well known to this audience, but I think I like to start with majority of the people in the world who have issues do not get minimally adequate and timely care, which sounds crazy. I mean, think of this slide, and if I say majority of the people with a broken bone don't get timely care, and you're like, no, that's not possible. But that's exactly what's going on with invisible mental illnesses, that people are not getting the treatment, and it's 80% or close in developing countries. So the point is there's a lot of scope where technology can potentially help. This is an incomplete slide intentionally because I'm not a clinician. You heard a couple of days ago, last week, from awesome CAMH clinicians on various issues. But in order to get people the care they need, there are various barriers, very well understood in various aspects, and they are also geospatially diverse. So what might be true for Canada might not be applicable in US, but broadly speaking, there are these high-level issues. And even when patients get in front of the care provider, the way to quantify their symptoms are somewhat dated. So this is a DSM criteria that probably was discussed last week. And Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders is almost 40 years old. I think they celebrated their 40th anniversary last year. And there are many, many ways in which these 9 combinations, as you don't have to go through them and read, various constructs that could be combined in various different proportions that can give rise to someone having moderate depression, severe depression, etc. But at best, there is a weak correspondence into underlying biological substrates of depression. And that's well-known fact at this point. There are several papers that talk about it. And guess what? This is just depression. We don't talk about depression and anxiety. It's almost like if you have fever, you cannot have cold. How? That's not true, right? They can combine. But that's the issue, right? If you are being diagnosed with depression and you have 3 out of the 9 symptoms with depression and 2 symptoms of anxiety, you might not classify for officially a depression, and that impacts how you get care, at least in US. And so it should not be surprising to most of you that clinical assessment and diagnosis of mental health disorders can be imprecise. And I want to be very clear, this is not pointing fingers at our clinician partners. That's not the case here. It's just that mental health disorders have complex traits and phenotypes, and even the manuals that have been prescribed are not very clear. And so the clinician-to-clinician interreliability is also very low. So what this means is, if you are diagnosed in Seattle, where I am from actually right now, so it's a little early for me, clinicians, if you are diagnosed with mental health disorder in Seattle, it's not likely that you will have the same sort of diagnosis or severity of diagnosis if you go down in California and get checked again. Think of that. I have fever as I measure with my thermometer in Seattle. It's probably the same everywhere, but that's not true for mental health. And it's somewhat connected to, we only see what we hear from people, but not probably what's going inside them for many reasons. The recall bias or lack of willingness to accept the fact, or things that are related to neurocircuitry that people don't even realize or understand. And that's where imaging has made a sea change in that sense, right? There's so much work that has been done in terms of neuroimaging and liquid central nervous system biomarkers. This slide will not do any justice, but the sense is the in vivo characterization of anatomy, pathophysiology, neurochemistry, concentration of the molecular interaction at the primary site of action, they all have been very well characterized in many cases. And here is a very recent paper that is of deep interest to me because it's sort of bridging the boundary between the meta-analysis of about 200 odd studies with 50,000 participants. I said 15, sorry if it came out as 50. And they were looking at the association between various temporal sections of the brain and how they relate to cognition and executive function. And yeah, there is a line, that's great, and they highlight that, but they also highlight the transdiagnostic variability across individuals. And that's where the interesting part starts, right? And the potential opportunity. It's difficult to tease apart a cohort level signal of if you have this area not lighting up or that area not lighting up, you have a potential diagnosis. It's not working like that. And there are many sources of heterogeneity. I'm not going to read them one by one, but it suffices to highlight major depressive disorder in itself is not a pure condition. It is an exception to have just MDD sometimes. And exceptions could be depending on the proportions, right? But the point is there could be many combinations. So you can have cancer and chronic issues with MDD. You can have depression and anxiety and alcohol disorder, etc. So the trajectory that people go through is not uniform across the board. Let me do a quick check on the screen so I'm not missing out on anything. Oh, thanks, Dan. I just saw that. I just need to invite you. Okay. Sorry, folks. Just give me 1 second. As I said, new to this platform. I'm trying to invite Dan now. Invite on screen. Okay. Here comes my partner in crime, who can help me navigate this much better. Thank you, Dan. Hopefully, yeah, you're joining. All right. Back on deck. So the approach about differential diagnosis, patient stratification, predicting treatment response, and hopefully early is something that are very open questions in this field. Not in all the fields, but especially in mental health. And my personal take on this is a lot of the research that is in vivo and in clinic is figured around and centered around what happens if you give a stimulus or there's a symptom, what do we see light up in the brain? And that has made us see change, as I said earlier, but it's also difficult to link that to real world behavior, as in if that scan and that image, that portion of the brain lights up, it doesn't mean it will light up the same way for majority or even a good amount of people with having the similar outcome or similar symptom experience. This has also been shown very clearly that the percentage of variance explained by different areas of the brain compared to a combined integrated predictive model there's a huge difference in that, and that's what the top image is showing on the right. So the point is, in order to predict outcomes and link symptoms to underlying behavior, we really need a more integrative approach. I'm probably stating the obvious here. And to the point it is, how do we build a digital thermometer for mental health, or thermometers, right? It might not be just one, there might be many more. To really create individualized trajectory on what might be going on. And the take-home message here is, if I see a patient in the clinic, and I'm not a clinician, just making this up, and should they be given a psychotherapy first or a pharmacotherapy, and if so, SSRI, SNRI, etc., and what dosage, so people do not suffer for months and months in terms of finding the right fit. And that's a big deal. And it comes and takes me back to the same 100-year-old sort of excerpt that I was quoting earlier, is hopefully these potential ideas, I would say at this point, can bring that objective yardstick to some extent to really understand at a systematic level on what works for whom and when. And that's a key phrase for me, what works for whom and when, and I'm going to tie this together a couple of times today. And this requires, I won't call it a paradigm shift per se, but an augmentation in terms of, in clinic, we are mostly capturing less than 1% of a person's lived experience, whether it's mental health or more, but I'm going to focus on one area, the broadly area of mental health. How do we get to a point where we can combine these? And the point is not that you will have episodic clinical assessments and then we want you to measure yourself every day, every minute. That's not the point here. It's more about getting a more continual sample rather than once in a while episodic, and it's not scalable also. You can't see everyone in the clinic every time. So how do we sort of bring it all together? There's this very clear analogy in my head. In 1980s, or I'm not that old, but there's clear examples in banking. Some of you might relate to it, that how we used to bank before the internet age. There was a manual transaction every time. We have come a long ways, right? I have hardly visited my bank in the last 10 years, actually. Most of that is on the phone. And I'm not trying to simplify things. The point is, there are severe issues in trust in the financial sector as well, and so are they in the health sector. But how do we bring them together is where I think the sweet spot is. So it's not about digital replacement. I do not want you to think about technology being able to replace what the care providers are doing for us. I don't think we are so far, and hopefully not in the future as well. That human in the loop is super important. It's more about how can you use technology to help people make better informed decisions and tractable decisions. So it's either a combination of hybrid sort of study, which is remote and episodic, or fully remote at a public health epidemiology level. And I will deconvolve these things in the next few minutes. It's also super important to have, as far as I'm concerned, digital technology augment in the clinical research. And the point is, it is not working. This picture is taken from a recent publication. There's a citation. It's not on. Oh, it's right there at the end. The point is, the top 10 drugs that are prescribed in US, majority of them don't work for a majority of people. If you take the case of number 5, which is Cymbalta, an antidepressant, it only works for 1 out of 9 people. Is that the kind of precision medicine we want? Probably not. So there are other issues in the traditional pharma pipeline, the increasing cost of recruitment challenges, and this is mind-boggling, but because I'm not from the Alzheimer's sort of disease domain, I recently read an article that 99% of phase 3 AD trials are basically failing, in simple words. We hopefully can do better, and there are various criteria, right, for the clinical trial, and I don't want to convert this into a clinical trial lecture, but all these phases have a clear, defined goal as far as FDA is concerned in terms of target engagement all the way to clinical efficacy, and hopefully these tools digital tools can augment in a way that they can help people, the researchers, make early decisions on no-go decisions on, this molecule is not working the way it should be based on the response of the patient before it goes all the way down to phase 3 and then fails. So hopefully that can help, and there's so much research being done in that area as well. All right, so I'm now shifting gears. So that's the why. Hopefully people got a sense of where different areas where digital can augment and help. Of course, this is non-exhaustive by all means. I did not get into the sense of why smartphones are important. I think that's probably obvious that majority of the people in the next 10 years in the world will have a smartphone connection. There are huge biases, don't get me wrong. We will talk about that at the end of this deck. But now I want to focus on, okay, I'm convinced I want to do a digital health study or digital mental health study. Where do I begin? What do I do? So I'm going to walk you through 3 examples in the next few minutes to give you a broad sense of how does it all come together. And these are real-world practical studies, some published, some not published. And before I start, I just want to do a quick screen check. Okay. Awesome. I would encourage you, if you're like, I don't understand this doesn't make sense, I have a question, please do ask. It's not a wrong question in the digital health field because it's very, very nascent. So I would love to get more sort of bidirectional if possible, rather than just a unidirectional speech at you. Okay, so let's start with the how. So simple. How do we create a digital health study? What the heck is it? So here is my very high-level take on this, and this image from a previous colleague at Sage. You create a study, you deploy it onto smartphones, you monitor compliance, analyze data, and you're done. I wish it was that simple. It's more like this. There are various aspects, and imagine you are handing out technology into the hands of people. This is very different than taking a static snapshot of a genome or a imaging and doing amazing analysis down the line with its secondary, tertiary, etc. Because you do it once and you are done, and then sort of you cross-analyze it over time. Here you are sort of doing it real time over time, and that has consequences. And it broadly sort of combines into these 6 buckets. People can create 8 buckets, it doesn't matter. The point is, there is design, there is technical platform, there is hardcore software engineering, and I'll give it a special emphasis. Think of this. We are deploying technology in the hands of people on their devices, wearables, whatnot. And as researchers, we are competing for people's screen time with the likes of Google's and Facebook, etc., which is fine. It's just that the benchmark of what a technology should look like is super high. Otherwise, people will not like your study. They will just go away and you will not collect any data. And then there is data science, there is consent, so all the governance related stuff. What can you collect? What should you collect? What you should not collect? I'm not going to get into all of these. I think each point here is our talk at the very least by itself. So my goal will be to give you a high level take on this, and then hopefully the people who are interested can get in touch, and there could be more opportunities in the future. So here is a real study that is being worked on right now, without going into specific details, of collecting real world mental health data from 3 countries. And so this is in progress as we speak. And to be very clear, I'm not involved in the study anymore. But the fundamental question is, what do we need to assess in terms of for outcomes of interest? There are many choices, right? The sources of your health data are tremendous. Should we just focus on devices, or should we do more? And that question will become clear as the day progresses. But the point I'm going to try to make now is, it's not about deploying a lot of measures, and it's not about getting excited. Oh, we are deploying a digital health study. Let's just roll on in terms of capture as much as we want, and then it will be a fishing expedition. We will do all the cross correlations to figure out what works for what sticks out. I don't think that's the right approach, at least not from a regulatory perspective, and that doesn't go anywhere with FDA unless you have a priori hypothesis on what you're trying to connect together. So here is what I think of. I don't think it's necessarily the standard in the field, so don't get me wrong. If this doesn't jive with you, feel free to ask questions around this. If you are looking at depression and anxiety, for example, you want to look at the paraphernalia of what are you trying to study, the social functioning, the work functioning, physical functioning, symptoms, how do people have recurrence, remission, time to recovery, etc. And you could select some of these slices depending on your key study goals. And that basically relates to what is your clinical outcome assessment of what are you trying to measure? How will you collect that? And I'm not going to focus just on smartphones. There are multiple ways to collect this information. So just to be clear, it's not just smartphones only. And then what is the fit for purpose? What I mean by that is we might have the best technology out there to capture someone's symptoms, but they might not be willing to be part of that, right? There are some invasive procedures that people might not like. So here are some bullet lists. What's the relevance to clinical outcome assessment? What's its verification and validity of the selected data streams that you are selecting? How will you account for temporal changes in technology? So the iPhone version changes, the Fitbit changes over time, hardware-wise, software-wise. How do you account for all of that? How will you reach the target population? This is where we connect the dots between the bias in terms of geospatial and the diversity and representativeness. There's a lot coming on this later. How much data and for how long? Just because you can collect, should you collect it for eternity? Probably not. What's the participant burden? Very related to the other points. How do you plan to collect active data, passive data, hybrid? We'll talk about that. Should it be at home, in person, or hybrid? What's the data governance and privacy policies for designing such a study? And when you think about this, this is how it rolls out, at least from my eyes. How will we enroll? How will we reach people? What data will we collect? How will the enrollment happen through a website? Is whether it's bring your own device, so people have to have smartphones, or we can dole out smartphones. These are all operational things, but they have a direct impact on what and who will participate in these studies, which impact your underlying representation of the population, target population that you're aiming for. So these are operational, yet very directly impacting the research questions. And so you will design this workflow. How will you do enrollment? What is e-consent? There are tons and tons of material available on e-consent, and I think that's one of the most crucial things that one need to do in fully remote studies. How do you consent people? And it's not about sending them a 100-page PDF. That's just boring, and it's very old. People don't read that, and they are not informed in a way that they should be. And then doing some assessments at day one, baseline, and more. Let me give you a simpler take on this. So how long will the study last? Why do you want to study people for 4 weeks, 10 weeks, 8 weeks? And this has to be connected to the clinical response time. So if you're giving someone an antidepressant, research has shown that they need about 12-ish weeks for showing some effect, especially with some dose changings, etc. And clinician friends can correct me on that. How will participants collect? How will we collect the data? Is it smartphone? Is it hybrid? What's the longitudinal data collection protocol? You have 12 weeks. How will you collect all these different kinds of measures? Can we get more specific? What are the daily and weekly surveys? How would you collect the phone usage behavior? And this leads us into, there are various things that you can collect from the phone and the various things that you should not collect from the phone, depending on the study. But broadly speaking, there is an active arm, so people have to complete an on-screen task, such as a cognitive measure, a survey. That's the simplest example. And then there could be passive data that is collected about their daily experience, which has its own set of biases, right? People have multiple phones. Phones are used by multiple household members sometimes. People have work phones. So the point I'm trying to make at each sort of connection here, that there is an opportunity and there is a challenge that is associated with it to address that. But it's not to say that if you have just 2 time points on someone's PHQ-9 over an year, is that sufficient? Or can we intersect that with a sporadic data that is collected about their daily experience and then use that to guide where things might go and might be at this point? So overall, it's still a lot of data that can help fill in the blanks between those episodic visits. Now, let me get some devil in the details here. So you are doing multimodal sensing, you're collecting real-world data across various modalities. And here is one idea, right? So you have a lot of sensors that we just talked about. So location, movement, phone screen, phone apps, etc. How do you connect these all together? This is a beautiful piece of review that I would recommend everyone. So the citation is below and the slides will be circulated. The point is, how do you connect these in a top sort of bottom-up workflow? So you can generate low-level features that could be one-to-many relationships, right? Location type, how much time you're spending at home, work, what kind of activity you're doing, how much phone usage do you have, what's your approximate bedtime and wake time, and so on and so forth, to really join these together in a way that leads to behavioral markers that ultimately connect to clinical states or clinical labels. And this is where the fun is right now, right? So there's so much research being done in how do you connect these together. And I want to make it very clear, it's not just about, just because the screen is showing sensors, so it's just sensors. It could be genotype, phenotype, right? Yes, we will need extreme high amount of sample size there because you start with 20,000 features for a genotype study, broadly speaking, as a number of genes. But the point is, I just don't want to give an impression that it's just one versus the other. It's complementary. This is the best picture I could find. That's why it's there. But you need to think about how can someone's location variation be related to their sleep, as well as potential anhedonia related stuff, so lack of seeking pleasure, etc. So it's one to many, not one to one. There is other interesting stuff that one could gather, right? So if you assess people through their life continuum on a daily basis or semi-daily basis, you can get a more sense of context. And I'll have data-driven examples for you later. So yes, if you capture GPS data, you can get to a lot of interesting insights, which has privacy issues as well, right? So can we maybe in the future even avoid capturing GPS data and get to these constructs? That's some of the work that I've done in the past. And here is a slew of it, right? Like a basic, very high-level slice of that. You can get, this is real data, so you can cluster people and sort of see where they are spending most time. So this is temporality over time and geospatial context, whether they are walking on a vehicle, driving, etc. And then you can intersect that data with geospatial semantic data from various public and Google or Yelp and others to get a sense of what's their, how much time are they going, or how many times they're going for groceries, spending some time at park, etc., and the local weather patterns that could impact their decision making as well. And these play various different roles. And just tying it back to what Andrea was saying yesterday, in terms of assessing someone's decision making, these are also the factors that could impact that, right? So if you are walking less this week in Seattle, probably it's too rainy, right? And so it's contextual. And that could impact your cognitive performance as well. So one leads to another. And then finally, as you go on your streak to collect these data, there is many levels of granularity in terms of data privacy, what's more sensitive, what's less sensitive, what people are willing to share. So that's another piece of research that needs to be taken into account, because just collecting GPS data on everyone, that's not going to work. People will not like it, they will leave it. So it's equally important to highlight what data we do not want to collect. So here are some examples. These are not recommendations, right? Maybe you're doing a mental health study and you don't want to collect raw GPS data because people don't want to be self-identified in a way that could just locate everything about their lives. Voice calls, people might not like it. There is a lot of research, etc., etc. So the point is you need to collect each bit of data with participant consent and not without it. And it's very easy to do that the other way around unintentionally, because once you open the APIs to your phone, you can collect a heck lot of data or from variables. So coming back, we went through maybe one or few slices of each domain, not at all an entirety by any means. So I'm assuming you will have more questions than answers at this point, but that was my intention, to give you a teaser to get a sense of what it might all mean. Let me take a quick break and do a screen check. Okay, cool. I don't see any questions so far. So let me go on. So actually, this is one more slide I forgot. And so this is sort of a summary, visual protocol summary of a study that you might want to create. Like, what's your baseline data collection? What's your longitudinal strategy? We talked about subjective and objective data. So surveys versus objectively collecting data about people's environment or their physical activity. And let me also admit, there is debate in the field about whether we should call them subjective or objective data or self-report versus measured data. And either way is fine. And I understand why people have concerns on one or other side. But that's how I think of putting things on a map for the team to look at a sense of what are we trying to do and why. And in my experience, this is super important before we get to let's analyze data that has come from, because unless you understand the data generating context, rest all will be, okay, there is a p-value and there is an inference, but does it mean anything? You need to really understand the underlying process for it. And I'll have more examples on that. So here is an example too. This is real world study that has been completed in the last couple of years. And this is my own work. And so again, bias alert, there is plenty of more research in this space. So Brighton studies were two RCTs, randomized clinical trial, that were funded by NIMH a couple of years ago. And the goal was to look at the feasibility for assessing and mediating, so mediating as an intervention in depression. There were passive data collected, survey data collected, and 3 different interventions, one being an Evo video game that has been now FDA approved for modulating cognitive control abilities. That's a common neurological deficit in depression. And there are other 2, problem-solving therapy that is internet-based, and then a placebo arm for health tips. We screened about 7,000 people, enrolled 2,000, but here's the take-home. This is a little busy slide, so let me walk you through it. The y-axis is r-square, so that's the total. So that's like how good the algorithm is doing in terms of predicting or classifying. And this is a regression-based approach in this case. And the y-axis is how much data do you need before you do good or better in terms of performance, in terms of a test case. The point I'm trying to make is it's not just look at all the data combined, so demographics plus baseline plus passive data for individuals over time. That's the orange box here. The point would be, do we improve beyond what we already know based on demographics and baseline data that clinicians have a good hang of at this point, right? And there's so much research being done. And at least in this large, very diverse cohort in the US, that is not true for some other studies that have focused on various specific sub-regions. We could not find a signal at the cohort level to say, if you understand people's lived experience through passive data, you would do a better job of predicting their daily mood. Not really. And it should not be surprising. And I came to this conclusion after spending many months at this problem in my team. The thing is, people are unique. We have small sample sizes in these studies. And if any one of you is paying attention, I am constantly changing numbers. So we started with 2,000 people, and I'm only showing you data for 200. That's the reality of doing real world research. You lose tremendous amount of people. And if you're wondering why and how that impacts, please ask me about it. So these are the point I'm trying to make in this case is people respond differently in terms of the y-axis here is different smartphone features that we captured. And this is showing association between those and people's daily mood. And I'm showing the FDR corrected p-values here for correcting for multiple testing. You see clear sort of clusters. Whether the line is up by a few rows, it does not matter. The point is there's a cluster of people for which the association is good, and there's a cluster of people who just don't respond to this sort of work. And that's fine. We need to understand that who will this work for and who will this not work for. And ultimately, the goal would be to combine this with response to treatment, right? In this case, antidepressants, but it could be anything else. And does it really make sense to see if we can predict the future response on an antidepressant based on their real world behavior? And that's an open question. I don't think there's a lot of research done in that. And this is also my work in progress. And we'll talk about that later in terms of how difficult it is to combine these data sometimes across different studies. But the goal is important. And that point is, how do we take a cohort and then say, you will fall in a trajectory of stratify that in no responders, medium-term responders, and etc. And that's a very exciting sort of open research area right now, because that could really save a lot of time, frustration for patients, and money at the same time. And given people are unique, we also looked at how can we use one as its own control. So you pick up any feature, you create a baseline behavior for that feature for an individual. So on an average, I walk about 5,000 steps. I'm just giving you a random number. That's not true for me. Sometimes it's higher. And then can we see any significant pattern on associations between that and the baseline, right? Or deviation from it. So this is you being used as your own control. And if you remember the picture that I showed you 10, 15 slides earlier about imprecise medicine, where most of the drugs are not working for people, that's what the author argues there as well, that maybe it's time for precision medicine in a way that works for individual and not for cohort, because an average change in a cohort doesn't really mean much for individuals, or at least most individuals. So here is an example for the same study. The y-axis is participants, and remember, the n has now changed from 2,000 to 200 to 120. In fact, and I mean, in a way, I'm showing the weakness of the work here, but that's the point, that we do lose a significant amount of people in this sort of way. And what you are being shown here is individualized prediction AUC's area under the curve for ROC curves compared against a null hypothesis. So when you shuffle the labels, and the take-home message is the y-axis on the heat map is again the importance of these features from a random forest classification model, and the x-axis is the features. And the mobility radius and how much you're walking is at the meta level really the key sort of predictor for daily fluctuations in mood. But it's very individualized. It does not show which direction people are going. So, oh, that slide is missing today. My bad. But let me show you an example on one particular person. So just a made-up name, Jane. The first four rows are showing Jane's social and physical mobility. And the last one is showing her daily mood. And you can see there's a clear inflection point, right, on where we see a change in association, no matter what you call it, between her improvement in PHQ-2, which is the first two questions of the PHQ-9 survey, for those who know that. But essentially, we are looking at the mood and the anhedonia. And how it's connected to her social and physical mobility as measured by these different proxy features from the phone. There's a bunch of issues here. There's missing data, technical noise, biological noise that this work has not looked into. So future work should look into that. So the point is, it's not just give me the data, time series data, do some analysis, get to the values, but it's also the understanding why data is missing and what's the underlying potential reasons for why it is missing. Here is one more example from a very different kind of a study looking at heart rate variability. So I'm giving you a teaser on what are the possibilities, right? And each graph here is an individual. The gray box is the heart rate variability at home. Yellow box, or whatever color of yellow you think it is the heart rate variability during the in-clinic intervention or in person. And then the green box is the value of the heart rate variability 1 month after. So looking at the persistence or resistance or remittance. And it's very clear, if you munge all these together in a model, and these are just 4 people, there were 100 plus people, the model will be an average of like, I have high fever, I have low fever, and the average is you have no fever. So that's what's going on in the cohort level modeling. But if you look at individualized N of 1 analyses, you see very clear differential paths in which who are getting better and continuing to remain on that trajectory. So long-term responder versus people who got better, but then as soon as they were back home, they're like, I'm back to my own routine, I will not change. So very individualized sort of approach to really derive meaning and context that could be useful. There's a whole another debate on the statistical sanity of some of these models with the cohort level model. And that's when I have a lot of fun with my statistical colleagues because they keep me honest. I'm going to go through this quickly. So hopefully you remember I showed you this picture earlier on the lower left-hand side of the screen. So this is the geospatial context. And let me give you one example now for it from a very different study in multiple sclerosis, but it's neurological. These are 3 different kinds of assays. I'm going to focus on the center one, that's cognition, and the task is voice-based digit symbol substitution test. And what you're trying to basically figure out is how correctly you can recall the digits that are shown on the screen. But the interesting fact is there is association, not causation. So let me be very clear in how the external environment and specifically temperature is impacting people's performance on this measure, accounting for all the other things, right? So the paper talks about that. And it's also very well-known fact in multiple sclerosis that the disease severity is impacted by increasing heat. So this is not just sort of a random association, it has underlying context. And the point is, if you were just measuring these people's cognition without taking into account the external environment, you might not account for these underlying changes that is happening potentially due to temperature. So that's the point. The context matters. Someone who is in the middle of a heat wave in Florida and assessing their cognition could be very different just because of external environment compared to someone in Seattle today when it's 70 and beautiful, right? So it depends. Okay, let's do a quick time check. Okay, we have enough time. So last example on the how, and then we will transition into the when aspect of it. So this is about how can we move the curve, bend the needle, whatever you want to say, on assessing, predicting when someone is at the heightened risk of a suicide attempt, behavior, ideation, etc. And just to get it right, there are distinct differences in when someone is suicidal in terms of ideating, attempting, or on those spectrum. And if you talk to a clinician, and as I have been warned in the past, it's not just one thing versus the other. Okay, so some of you might have seen it from my recent presentation on the open house, but I think it's important to highlight over 50 years of work, we have not really seen any major success in predicting when someone is at the highest risk of self-harm or suicide attempt or ideation. We know who might be at risk, and that's important. I'm talking about who, as in the people, the kind of people, but not when they are at risk. So we know people on the lower socioeconomic ladder for various different stresses in life would be at higher risk. But we don't know when. And if you don't know when, how do you intervene? And the other reason is, and which is in this case actually good news, is it takes about on an average 25 failed attempt before a person is able to ultimately kill themselves, which is unfortunate. But then that means there's a lot of opportunity to intervene. So we try to see if online information seeking behavior, as in how people are looking for information online, could be used in looking at potential risk factors. And the goal now is not about this particular project here. The goal is to show how different kinds of information. So remember my first slide or first few slides, what is mental health? And it's a conversation that you're having with your peer, potentially could leak a signal about your mental health. That's what the point is, right? So you tease apart some various kinds of real world data to really get to potential proxy signals that could be related to the underlying outcome of interest or disease, illness, etc. So that's the goal here, right? And that's where this sort of vertical data integration becomes. So don't think of this as this particular project. Think of this as an idea. How do you sort of vertically integrate data across different ways? And so in this case, we collected intense amount of data on online information seeking behavior, and then try to vertically integrate that with clinical research data in terms of people's self-harm survey data. So, and the EHR data. So there is gold standard per se in terms of when people attempted to kill themselves because they were fortunately saved by the system. We try to consent them to be in this study. And here is a real data. And by the way, the paper is below, but more importantly, I'm trying to get a sense of how do you sort of put this picture all together. So temporal timeline of online search data now intersected with the suicide attempt date. That is very precise. And now we are looking T+1 days and T-1 days, T-2 days, etc. And you get a sense of what is this person thinking, quote unquote, privately. And if you are wondering, as very active web users, oh, I might search in incognito mode, or I might search in somewhere else, you are all right. This is not about getting it right for everyone. This is about majority of the people who sort of go about their life the way Google expects them to, and then give Google a lot of data. And it really teases apart and make it very clear. We can confirm it clinically later that the person did consume a liquid in an attempt to kill themselves, but the story was being formed a couple of days before the attempt. And that's where the beauty is, right? There are open questions about how this will work out in the real world, and I'm happy to report that this work has now been funded into a grant, so we probably will explore it in more detail in a larger cohort. But the technical aspect of this is we take a search query, so how long does codeine take to hit? And we try to compare that with known risk factors of suicide. So this is an anchored approach, not completely data-driven, and then try to see how closely this matches to a risk factor one, such as suicide communication, risk of suicide, etc. Which basically, this is a pretty busy slide, and this is a supplementary picture. I'm going to talk to you from a sense of, here is a time series data on curve number 1. You featureize it in a way that it has semantic meaning and behavioral meaning. What do I mean by that? How people are searching, so how many searches they are conducting in a day, and what kind of searches they are conducting in a day. So that's what I mean by behavioral in terms of number of searches in a day, and semantic in terms of the content of those searches in a day. And they give rise to various features. And then the goal is to see if these features are distinct on days before the suicide attempt, which is, you can't see my mouse here. The pink box is the time before the suicide attempt, and how random is those searches in a normal period. And this is a very simple approach that could be used for many personalized analysis. And that's why I'm trying to show that. So let me repeat it. If you have a temporal time series and you have event of interest, and if the time series is big enough, you can do some of the simulations like underlying bootstrap sampling to really get to the null hypothesis. Potentially, there are problems with that. And then look at the p-value based on this approach, because you sort of find the value corresponding to your area of event of interest, and then compare that to the null distribution. And if you are vaguely interested in this, in our paper, we talk about many more citations in terms of how this could be done. But it's a very non-powerful, non-parametric approach to really not care about the underlying distributional assumptions, etc. Just the take-home message on this is, so the density shown by the black line is that null distribution that I talked about, and the vertical line is the corresponding feature value for some days before the suicide attempt. And I don't need to convince you on telling you that this is significant. It is significant for that individual. It might not be significant for that cohort. And that's not the point. We're talking about individualized sort of analyses here. That's been a common theme for the last few minutes, right? So as I wrap up my second section here, the point is, think about various sources of data. And the next session that Dan will lead will talk about this. And then how do you cross-connect them? And I will talk about that in the next section very specifically, to really generate cross-integrated sort of learnings that feed back into the system, right? So it's not just give me the EHR data alone, or give me this variable data alone. And it's probably a combination of it, because they fill in the blanks at different level. Okay, we are at the final section. Let's do a quick screen check. Okay, there is one question, and I'll break the monotony here and answer that question now. So if I understand correctly, there was a loss in number of participants from 3,000 to 300, despite paying them $90 for research participation. Interesting. Thank you, Anakriti, for asking that. So that's very insightful. So there are two reasons. The decrease from it's actually 2,000 to 300. When I get to this section, the next few slides will talk about why on some of that. But they are mainly, let me articulate it well. There are two specific reasons. One is people go away, and it's hard to sort of understand why. I will give you some teasers on potential reasons. And the second is more of an empirical, right? So people might stick around in the study, giving some data every week, but it's not enough to join the dots between the subjective measures, quote unquote, the surveys, and the objective measures, quote unquote, the sensor data. So in order to have enough data for everyone, we sometimes need to get rid of people who don't have the data. It's not the best thing to do, but the right approach is, if you are doing that, to do an analysis on, if you are leaving out certain set of people, are you biasing your data set in terms of your predictability on who are you predicting for, on how generalizable it is. And so next is exactly that section that I'm going to talk about. But that's a very insightful question. Thank you. There's one more. Okay, so in the James data missing slide, is it possible that it is similar to a New Year resolution where one is enthusiastic at the start, download of an app, but then they don't make it to the 21st day? I see what you're saying. How do you account for that sort of enthusiasm in your data, I guess? So let me answer that first. Yes, it is very clear, and the next few slides will make it even more empirically clear that when people start, they are excited, and within a few days, they go away. But even that understanding is not very clear to the field, and people are working with health communication experts and behavioral economics expert to understand how do you keep these people engaged. So just hold on to that thought for a few more slides, and hopefully it should at least be contextualized. But what you're saying is right, and I don't think there is a magic wand in the field to say, do this and it will fix itself. But let me highlight, compared to a clinical sample that has its own biases for in-clinic studies, I think it's okay to even start at 20,000 people and even get a baseline assessment of them for the first time. That in itself is new and novel and for the first time, because think of someone sitting in a remote part of Canada being assessed for the first time through a smartphone or through a website for their cognition or whatnot, who you probably would have every time missed because the clinical trials don't happen to reach those regions. So there are pros and cons, but I think it's still feasible even if they disconnect later. Second question, what about the initial fake values which people might fill in the app, which may be not reflective of exact state of that person? That's also a very insightful question. So there is a whole slew of research in this, especially for studies where people are being paid monetary incentives, as in money. Couple of ways to address that. One should never be coercive in paying people in a way that they are just coming in the study for money. And there is a whole set of research in determining what's a right amount of payment that's not coercive. No matter what you do, people will come in still for different kinds of reasons. And one of them is just, I want to get done with the study and move on because I want to get paid and move on with my life, and I don't care about this research. But if you look at 2,000 people data, you can do psychometric analysis on who responded to what kind of question at what speed. And that can disentangle, a PHQ-9 was completed in 10 seconds versus on average it takes about a minute. I'm ballparking numbers. That probably means that person was just faking it, right? So very active area of research, especially in very large cohort studies, to understand who probably is just giving in, gaming the system for various reasons, not just monetary. But in my experience, that proportion is less than 10% on average. If you have a very highly paid study, then that number obviously goes up. Thank you, Anukriti, for asking those. So let's move on, back on deck. So I'm doing a time check. I think I'll take about 15 more minutes. So the goal is to give you guys 15 more minutes of break, because I think I'll need a break after this. All right, so the theme here is, if we build tech, communities will come and embrace it. As a researcher or research community builds technologies and people will just love them. Yeah, maybe, but we have to be careful to not strangle them with our research. And without pointing fingers, there is a whole slew of industry researchers that are using tricks. There is no harm in saying this up front, that behavioral economics is being used or misused to keep us engaged on various social media platforms, which is beginning to give its own issues, right, on anxiety related stuff with social media. And that's a quote unquote a new diagnosis now. So I think as researchers and as responsible researchers, we should be very parsimonious in what we want to do here, in terms of just because you can ask it cheaply, I don't think you should. And just because you ask something, don't expect the others will respond in a way you intended it to. So things will go wrong, and things have gone wrong drastically. And here is one example. Again, bias alert, my own research, but there are only few sort of papers available in this domain, and I'm showing you my work, but it's very similar. The take-home message is, people have deployed hundreds of studies or tens of studies, depending on what kind of study you're looking at. And there is open secret now, I guess, that people don't stick around in these studies beyond a few days. And we don't really know anything beyond that. Where are these people coming from? What are the issues they might have in a very systematic manner? So this is potentially a first attempt at looking at that. And I think from your perspective as participants in this course, the take-home messages, let me distill it out clearly. So this is showing the geographical divide in where the participants are coming from with respect to the state population proportion. So you are oversampling from the east and the west coast, and you are undersampling from the middle of the country and the southern region. I'll just make one sort of politically connected statement on this is, if I were to change the color to blue and red, things will become distinctly clear on what I'm trying to say. And the point is, if you are an obesity researcher, this map should worry you a lot. You should be worried that the southern part of the country, where the most obesity cases are and the prevalence is very, very high compared to other parts, is not actually participating in this research. It's now proving to be true for the COVID vaccine also in some cases. I do not employ causation here by any means. The point that I'm trying to make is, as you devise your studies, whether it's US or Canada, we have to be really very careful in who we are trying to reach and how do we partner. Just putting a website out in the front will not cut it. It just doesn't work. So this is Anukriti that you were asking. This is a survival curve showing what proportions of people last in a study for how long. And the take-home message is we lose about 50% of the participants in first 7 to 10 days. This is not as bleak as it sounds. Let me highlight it, right? The 50% that remains, or the 10% that continues even further, is still a significantly large amount of number, potentially even more diverse than what we could collect in the clinic. So it's not as bad as it sounds. Things could be better, but the point is it's complementary, augmenting the in-clinic brick and mortar research and not replacing it. That's the point. And here is the silver lining. So a couple of studies had people who were referred by clinicians who were partnered in that study. And you see an order of magnitude difference in how long people stick around in the study just because their clinician told them to. So the point is, if we do it right in a way that people understand why they should participate, and people do listen to their doctors, right? Sometimes, at least surveys are showing that. Or compared to a researcher just putting out a study, then there is a huge amount of difference in who participates in those studies and for how long. So these are good signs that could be used for operations and translating research into real care, potentially at CAMH and otherwise. You can also look at human behavior. So y-axis on these 8 heat maps is the number of days, starting from 1 to 84, so 12 weeks. And each green dot is whether a participant did something on that day in the study. And these are very different studies, right? There are 8 different disease areas broadly. I'm not going to get into today. But if you look at the proportion of users, there is a behavior similarity across the studies, and the proportion in each cluster might be different. And that could be related to various different factors, but you get a sense of who these dedicated users are, sporadic users are, and the story continues here as well. There is significant over-enrichment of minorities in the least active clusters. That's where the challenge is, right? Not only you have differential recruitment based on where the minorities might be located, but they also leave the study early or differentially engage in a way that's not very continuous. So a lot of work needs to be done in that space. And I'm going to cut to the chase here for what it impacts and how it sort of impacts. So this is my own hand. Hopefully it's clear that I'm a brown guy. And I've used this example many times, so some of you might have already seen this and heard this. But if you don't understand the underlying population and you are analyzing their data for building algorithms, this is where you can get to potentially. And so the fairness and ethics and AI research all talks about it. This is few years old now, so I'm not pointing fingers at the company. That's not the goal here. But in general, if you are building algorithms, you really need to be very careful and be explicitly transparent about who are you building it for and who you are not building it for. I don't think there's anything wrong in building an algorithm that is white-centered or black-centered or brown-centered, maybe because you only have data for that population, but you have to be explicit and clear that, by the way, this is only tried on this sort of population and this doesn't work on the other side and we really need more data for it. Otherwise, you will end up here, and that's increasingly and extremely frustrating. There is the other side of this, which is you are collecting a lot of data from the target population, and what is acceptable to them is something that we don't fully understand, and dare I say, sometimes don't care, which then impacts how they participate or don't participate in the studies. And I think that's true even for in-clinic studies, right? People sometimes miss the point on why the people need to be consented in a way that they really understand what they're getting into. And as soon as they understand, they leave the study. So there is growing research in this area. I'm going to show you one paper very highly, again, my own work today. That's the theme of the day, I guess, is how recent events related to data leaks, Facebook scandal in 2018, so we're talking about pre-COVID era, hopefully you remember that, could impact people's ability, willingness to share data in online biomedical research. So I'm going to keep it brief. This is a study design. So the focus of this slide will not be what I did, but the focus should be, this is how you can create a remote study very, very cheaply to test some of the ways in which you can understand why people are willing to do something or not willing to do something. So we devised a survey with clinical experts and deployed it on the web using RedCap and recruited participants from Amazon MTurk. We talked a lot about how we reduce the bias that are known about MTurk, and so people are only from the areas of where we are interested in. So US participants, high school graduates, etc., to reduce the bias. And then we asked them their willingness to share data over time in April and September. Here are some results. So this graph shows willingness to participate in a study depending on who is sponsoring the study. And back in those days, and probably true even now, there is huge bias in whether a university-led study or a pharma-led study and how people will engage in them. And so that's very interesting. And the two different bars here are showing the temporal differences, and it's most significant for pharma that goes down over time. And I will not be surprised that that trend is also continuing for people who have issues with the trust, and even in the current scenario for vaccinations, right? So clearly there are perception issues, if not anything more, in that space. And I'm not an expert in human-centered communication to say more. And then willingness to participate is different from willingness to share their personal data. And it's even worse, right? I mean, university-sponsored academic research still tops it, but the pharma goes down even further. And the point is not that pharma should not be in the research domain. That's not what I'm trying to say. It's more about how should you address this by participating with the right partners so you can address the trust and privacy issues. That's the key point here. And here is what people are saying, right? I mean, this is verbatim. They do not trust. The interest is only for profit, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not my opinion. It's the representation of population that's talking about this. So as researchers, when we think about technology, we really need to think about how we can balance the study participations and the target population needs with the researchers. And as I'm moving towards the end, I think it's also important to highlight all this work that we do needs to be really understood from the context of standardization. We have way too much data available now, which is amazing, but it's incredibly hard to analyze that data and integrate that. So the next session that Dan will lead will start to get into that, and some of the session after that will follow some of the various ways in which we can use external services to really do analysis that is tractable, reproducible, and it's hands-on in that sort of experience if you want to follow along. So my personal belief is that we really can move the curve from the current status quo to more of an objective, proactive, personalized, continuous monitoring. And it doesn't have to work for everyone as long as we can make a clear determination on who it works for, when, and for how long. So I'm tying it back now. And there are various ways in which this can help in design of studies, early detection, treatment resistance, understanding who the treatment works for, personalized manifestations of disease symptoms and severity, who is responding, who's not responding, and potentially aid the go, no-go decision-making in clinical trials. So plenty of opportunities there. With that, I will thank you for listening to me for last 75 minutes. That's a lot. It's a lot of one-way talk. And I will use the opportunity to brag personally that I'm going to start a new digital health and AI research group at KCNI. And so the focus of that group will now come together hopefully nicely. My interest and my group's interest will be around what risk and protective factors of mental health impact who, when, and for how long in the real world. And what this means is I'm also going to be hiring, and I'm in the process of doing that. So if any one of you is interested in this space, broadly speaking, the skills are very broad. You don't have to be an ML expert. I invite you for a virtual coffee. Please reach out to me, and I'm happy to have a conversation. So next up will be the session around population-based resources and the Brain Health Data Bank. That will be co-taught, I guess, or we'll be speaking together, Dr. Dan, Joanna, and myself. And with that, I will look at the questions, if there are more. Okay. So there's one more question. Let me click on start answering. How does the survival rate in research study compare to survival rate in a user engaging in a new non-research app? So that's very interesting, Akshay, that you asked that, because I was digging for that data when I was trying to compare it. It's actually similar or maybe worse. And so the churn rate, that's how they define this. The unfortunate thing is no real company is willing to publish their user level engagement data. So whatever I'm saying is sort of anecdotal and gleaned from Google searches. But the churn rate in smartphone apps is extremely high and very disproportional. So majority of the users on the app stores are being driven by just a few apps, and you can name them, right? The Facebooks or the Googles, paraphernalia, or Twitters, etc. And then the rest, so less than 1% of the apps occupy most of the user attentions. So not very clear, but some of the research that I've seen, research as in white papers, they talk about 5 to 10% engagement. But the metrics of engagement and how you define who is engaged and who is not very, very clear. So, yeah. All right. With that, we are at the end. I can meet you all back in Gather Town. So yeah, thank you, Aaron, for posting that. Unless there are any more questions. Great. I guess it's my time to end the broadcast now. All right. Thank you all. I'll see you in Gather Town and then talk to you later today.